And hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Pumpkin Coptercast, the only video game show. So, if you like Pokemans and wanting to go catch them all and wanting to be the best, like no one ever was, I have with me a guest who's writing a book about literally exactly that thing I just said. I'm here with I'm here with my guest and fan of the other show, What I Do, Daniel Dockery.
Hey,
Hello.
thank you for having me.
So, thanks for being here. So, Daniel, how about we start things off with you telling the definitely real audience that I have listening to this all about who you are.
Hi, I am Daniel Dockery. I am the author of the upcoming book, Monster Kids, How Pokemon Taught a Generation to Catch Them All. I am a senior writer at the anime streaming service Crunchyroll, and I write for a bunch of other sites like Wired, Vulture, Pace Magazine, Polygon, and a slew of others. So yeah, that's mostly what I do. Write about anime and then about Pokemon. That's pretty much my existence.
Okay. So, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this, when did you first come across video games?
I first I actually I'd been kind of enamored with video games for a long time. My parents never really bought any because uh, due to the money issues of being kind of a lower middle class family in a rural state, they were just kind of outside on my periphery. Um, and I I never really I wasn't able to get into them. I was kind of on the outside looking in. My friends talked about them. I saw them in stores, but they were just they were just outside my sphere. And then my first video game, actually, other than like arcade games that my parents would pretend to put quarters into at the CC's Pizza. My first video game console was um, actually a purple Game Boy Color with Pokemon Red version. And that was my
Mm-hmm.
first. That was the first one I ever owned. It was the first my first game I ever really dived in. I was ever really able to like dive into actually. So
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I have a fit based on what we're here to talk about today. I might know the answer to this, but what was your favorite game or games growing up?
well, surprisingly enough, I went through quite the Pokemon obsession.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably Pokemon. As time goes on, obsessions changed, and then it started with Pokemon, and then I got a GameCube. Or actually, my parents bought me an old Super Nintendo like 3 years after Super Nintendo was out,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, from a Roses, which is a kind of a regular discount chain.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it still exists anymore. Um, I was about to compare it to Kmart, but I don't know if Kmart exists anymore either. So, um, yeah, I after I became really obsessed with that. Still play Pokemon in the background. Got a GameCube in 2002. Became super obsessed with that. Basically, for a little while, I at least had a fleeting obsession. I, gosh, aside from Pokemon, like I remember like dedicating a year to my life to like Resident Evil 4,
Uh-huh.
which is a fantastic, nearly perfect game.
Mm-hmm.
Just exploring every nook and cranny of the game, replaying and replaying and replaying and replaying. And that's kind of how it tends to be with video games. I've never, because I didn't have a lot of them growing up, I've never really been like, okay, I'm done with that game, on to the next one. I usually get a game, and I'll obsess about it for put dozens to hundreds of hours into it, and then I'm done, and then I'll move on to things. So I'm not exactly like a super big video game expert, aside from kind of Pokemon and monster collecting, which I've done far too much looking into.
Yeah, I know. That was growing up. That was, me and Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door.
It's a good game.
Yep. And so, yeah, and what would you say is your favorite game and/or games now?
My favorite game right now. You know what? I think my favorite game that I'm playing right now is I'm replaying, because I don't have a lot of time. I'll be doing a lot of book stuff and promoting. I'm writing like another book right now, so I don't have a lot of time to devote to video games at the moment. But I'm replaying after the announcement a few days ago. I'm replaying Breath of the Wild.
Mm-hmm.
And that game, hot take, is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. I'm really, really enjoying it in ways that I didn't quite before. Like before, the weapon thing, where if you use it too much, it breaks, thing kind of annoyed me. But now that I've played it once before, and I'm kind of playing it again and learning how to like more carefully, create and distribute items amongst myself, it's not such a worry. It's a really fun, well-crafted game. I'm a big fan of it. 5 years after Breath of the Wild came out, I can say that Breath of the Wild's pretty good.
Yeah. And yeah, and now let's dive into the meat and potatoes of this. Like, if this were an actual like physical talk show with a set, this would be the point where I would, where I would hold up my copy of the book that I somehow got ahead of time, or maybe stole, and just the cameraman would just zoom in really uncomfortably. So yeah, you got a book about Pokemons. One of the something that, as like you've guessed the last time we Skyped together, is like probably one of my permanent hyperfixations. So yeah, what's like the rundown you can give us about it?
So if I had to provide like a quick rundown without listing absolutely everything in it, it's basically a journey through the ins and outs of Pokemania, which was an era from late 1998 to, I'd say, maybe early 2002, when Pokemon was either this pop culture Goliath in the United States, or existing in a landscape that was still, if it wasn't as popular, was still kind of obsessed with it in different ways. And just diving through that, and I go through all of the series that kind of came to North America in its wake, like Digimon, which I'm a big fan of, and Yu-Gi-Oh, which I started out as a pretty decent fan of, and then became a bigger fan of it as I was writing the book. And all those, and it's both nostalgic and analytical. And I think that if you were a fan of Pokemon around that time period, or kind of want to get into like what all the inescapable fuss was about during that time, then Monster Kids, How Pokemon Taught a Generation to Catch Them All, is for you.
Okay, so just as someone who is the exact opposite of you, in the sense that I am not a writer and don't know, like, just like I see people like writing books, and I'm just like, this is black magic. So like, just how did you first decide like the shape of what this book was going to take? Did you like sit down and like write notes about like each point of the game, or did you like each point of the book, or did you like start writing like one part of the book and that like informed how you would get to the next part?
So like I've always loved monster collecting and monster training
Mm-hmm.
franchises, or collecting adjacent franchises. Um, and it was around the 20th anniversary of Pokemon when I was playing Sun and Moon in a. I used to live in Brooklyn, New York, and I was playing
Mm-hmm.
Sun and Moon and I just finished the Mega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and I was playing
Yep.
Sun and Moon in both, I think, pretty good games. And I was playing them in a laundromat, as I was wont to do, because I spent a lot of time in a laundromat, because my tiny shoebox apartment did not have laundry facilities. Um, but I realized that I wanted to write something about it. I wanted to write something big about it, because I felt that hadn't been done before in a way that was, one, like a published book, and two, that was satisfying to me personally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I decided I was going to write an encyclopedia of monster collecting stuff, and I started that. And then I got like 3 entries in. Like I did Pokemon, I remember I did Monster Rancher, and I remember I did Metabot. And then I realized I was writing kind of like these glorified Wikipedia entries. Like I wasn't giving myself much room to like create like a story or play around or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. I'm going to do a history of Pokemon. I'm going to do a history from Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori, creating Game Freak magazine, all the way to at that point Sword and Shield coming out, and I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote it. I wrote the sample chapters, because in nonfiction, when you're trying to sell a nonfiction book, if you're doing fiction, unless you're like an author that they trust to make them money hand over foot, you have to write the whole thing. But in nonfiction, you have to write a like 3 chapters, 3 sample chapters, and then a full proposal, which basically says, this is who I am, this is what I can bring to the table, this is why I should write the book. You're basically selling yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back on that old proposal, it's terrible. It's a nightmare. But I sent it out to agents for representation, and the overwhelming response I got back was, you obviously care about Pokemon and are passionate about it. Proposal could use some work, but publishing is a little bit slow. And unless they rush this out to coincide with some kind of big event, or it's super timely, then it's going to be at least a year before it hits shelves. And by that point, there's a new Pokemon game before I finish the setup. So it's going to be outdated when it's new, when the book is new. So that kind of put a skewer in that idea. So I went back to the drawing board again, and I decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do the part that interests me the most, the part I can do a kind of A to B story with. What can I find a narrative about? And I found the Pokemania years,
Mm-hmm.
which I through and are very near and dear to me, and the years that I'm most fascinated by, because you can find kind of an encapsulation of everything Pokemon is and will be in those years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started that, and I sent it out to the woman who's my agent now, Cass Murray, who's incredible. And she was like, okay, she actually turned down the Pokemon history book. She was like, this sounds cool, but not for me. And then I sent this back to her because it had a story, because she was looking for pop culture stories, and she was like, this is something I can work with. And eventually it was sold. In a few months, it was sold to Brittany Pirelli, who's my wonderful agent, or my wonderful editor, I mean. And I was off writing it.
Okay, and yeah, so like I'm just going like I'm not sure like how much this like it was different for me. Like I didn't really know about the games because like by the time like the first games and like the anime came out, I was like pretty sure like just slightly over like half the age of like the target demographic of the anime at the time. So was the anime a big part of like your experience like for with Pokemon back in the day and like now like writing the book, or is like you've or like I've only like really started getting like into the Pokemon anime again like around like the 2016s when like the X and Y seasons were wrapping up.
No, they were huge for me growing up. I watched the first episode because you know, I remember it played early in the morning on UPN 48, which was channel 14, it was the Greensboro, Winston, High Point UPN affiliate station. And they played it at like 6:30 in the morning, and they had hyped it up with all of these commercials, which you can find some of them on YouTube now. And they're a nostalgia trip to watch. But I've watched it from the first episode, Pokemon I Choose You, and I was so enraptured by it. And now the anime isn't such a big part of my life, mainly because I have work and books and a lot of other hobbies and stuff. It's always been near and dear to me, and I've seen all of it, but I've only really rewatched kind of over and over again the original series, which is Ash, to the point where Ash and Misty and Brock depart and Ash leaves for Hoenn. And after that, I get a little bit less dedicated to it. But rewatching it made me realize that there's a lot of quality bits to it, and a lot of really cool stuff that sometimes I think gets taken for granted. And now modern Pokemon, like I liked X and Y, I really like Sun and Moon, and Journeys is fun.
Yeah. So I don't know, just as Tom and I have been, slowly just like chaining ourselves, just like being like every single allegory about immortality and being careful what you wish for by just committing to something that is probably going to take us a lot longer than I thought.
You're about to go to Johto, right?
Yep, and
that is a hill to climb.
Yeah, so just as I remember a lot of these episodes from when I was a youngin', and now that, in internet times I'm like old, and I realize there are still like a lot of episodes that just like get me right there. Like I still remember getting just like a little bit emotional when Ash said goodbye to Butterfree, or when he thought he was going to like say goodbye to Pikachu, or in the first movie when he died for all our sins.
Pokemon introduced. I contributed to a kind of a Pokemon 25th anniversary magazine, and I kind of wrote in it like the Bye Bye Butterfree episode. As somebody who writes about anime and watches a lot of anime, I like the art of crying over anime. I have mastered it. But Bye Bye Butterfree was like the first time I ever cried over anime. And it, like as a little kid, I was weeping. It was so, and like now still like with the music and the flashbacks and everybody's crying on screen. If they're going to cry on screen, then I might as well start crying on screen. And I started crying in the theater when Ash died in the first movie and Pikachu was crying. Oh, good Lord. Pokemon has made me into a wreck so many times.
And yeah, and either like while you were in the process of like writing this book, or maybe just on like your own time for funsies, did you ever like look into some of the episodes that were banned for various reasons, like the Porygon episode, the one where Ash gets a bunch of guns pointed at him? Did you like ever like look into those?
Yeah, they're in a modern through a modern lens, like it's always going to be funny that like the gun episode got
Mm-hmm.
banned because now we're living in an age of like of streaming services where you can create an account and see anime with you can watch. I don't know, the first one that came to my head, like Attack on Titan, where the first episode is just people getting eaten alive by giants, just these screaming violent deaths.
Mm-hmm.
And so you look back on it and you think like it's so silly that they banned like this gun episode, but looking back at Pokemon and talking to the people that like extensively worked in the game and anime localization and a lot of like and looking into a lot of like the censorship issues that they were kind of like dealing with at the time and like the lines that they didn't want to cross and stuff. It was really careful. You had to be kind of like you had to be pretty careful about what you could and couldn't do, especially because people had networks kind of had it out for anime at the time. They didn't trust it. A lot of people kind of viewed it as like an inferior form of animation. Like it was something that you made cheaply, you brought it over, and you could kind of like do whatever you wanted to it, and then dump it whenever it became profitable.
Mm-hmm.
Or became non-profitable. And so they're forced to play this weird game where like the leniency that might be allowed to like another show wouldn't be allowed for something like Pokemon. Which is it's changed a little bit now because again you can find these kind of graphic, fun, violent series on like Crunchyroll or Netflix or whatever. Or yeah, but you had to play by different rules when you were trying to fill in a Saturday morning kids block or put your show on early morning syndication.
Okay. And yeah, and you met like before we wrap things up, you mentioned that you covered it. You looked at and gained an appreciation for Yu-Gi-Oh! And like over the course of writing this book.
Yeah.
What are your reactions to like first Yu-Gi-Oh! And now Pokemon are franchises in which the phrase "on motorcycles" is now applicable? How do you feel that in the most recent trailers for Scarlet and Violet, you got essentially Pokemon motorcycles?
So there's a the ethos behind like I don't dislike them. I think they're kind of cool. They're kind of
Mm-hmm.
cool looking dragons. But obviously the ethos behind like what constitutes a Pokemon, what is complex or not too complex for a Pokemon design has changed over the years. That's unavoidable. I don't really have a problem with that. I just think it's kind of funny. Somebody like a kid who's going into Scarlet and Violet for the first time is going to be like, well, those are Pokemon,
Mm-hmm.
That's their first experience with Pokemon. Those are Pokemon, and I don't want my 33-year-old Gandalf self to be like, no, those aren't Pokemon. You don't understand. This is a Pokemon, and just like holding up like Bellsprout or whatever. I don't want to. I think they're funny designs inherently because you're just like zooming on a lizard that turns into a motorcycle, which is inherently Looney Tunes. But I don't want to dictate what can and can't be a Pokemon nowadays because it's again it's always going to be somebody's like first game, and they're going to stick with the franchise for a lot longer going forward than I probably am.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I think they're fun, and I cannot wait to roll on my dragon cycle.
Yeah. and yeah, so yeah, I think that with that we can begin to wrap up this episode of the Pumpkin Copter Cast. I would like to thank professional word writer and word sayer Daniel Dockery for joining me to say some words about Pokemon and promote his book. And
Thank you for having me.
Daniel, if people would like to pre-order this book, like I literally just finished doing while we were talking, where would they, where would be the places to do that?
So you can pre-order it through pretty much any major bookseller if you're able to. See if you can pre-order it through one of like an independent bookstore. Always support independent bookstores. If you have to, if you get it through like Barnes and Noble or like Amazon, I'm not gonna like begrudge you. Um, there's also an audiobook narrated by the original Four Kids voice of Ash Ketchum, Veronica Taylor.
Ooh.
Which is available. And if you want to, try to request it for your local library system. That's another thing that deserves all the support you can give it. And there, I somebody did it for my local library system, and that was so cool to me. Is the fact that people are going to be able to check those books out at libraries near me. And I'm gonna have to try really hard not to check them out, just to like have them. So yeah, those are the ways.
Okay, and yeah, and if any of you enjoyed my words in this conversation and you'd like to hear some more of them, you can, like, rate, comment, subscribe. Maybe I'll be able to get double-digit subscribers sometime between now and before I die. Who knows? Uh, yeah, and if after you're finished giving your money to like the purchase of this book, which, as Daniel said, you can get through like, those websites that support indie bookstores, or, Amazon or Barnes and Noble, which is what I did. If you have any money left over, you can go to patreon.com/thepumpkincoptercast, where for as little as $1 a month, you can submit questions for me to use in interviews when I actually remember to do that. And yeah, and if you want to hear like Daniel talk about Pokemon some more in a conversation with me and another nerd who's obsessed with Pokemon, you can go to Gotta Recap 'Em All, where God is a horse, so nothing is off limits. And when Daniel joined us, myself and Tom, on the show, we talked about Ash just throwing down at the Orange League and proving that long before he got to Alola, he actually was the champion. And so, yeah. Uh, so, like you said, Monster Kids, How Pokemon Taught a Generation to Catch Them All by Daniel Dockery. That's that guy. Pre-order it, get the audiobook narrated by the original Ash, which I just learned about. That was a thing happening today. And yeah, this has been Gotta Recap 'Em All. And as I say at the end of every show, have a gourd day, everyone.